Everyone thinks they know why the flood came. Ask anyone. They'll say the same thing. People were bad, so God got angry and he drowned the world. Simple, clean, and almost completely wrong. Because here's what your Bible never actually says. It never says God lost his temper. It never says he acted in rage. In the oldest account of the greatest catastrophe in human memory, the word used for what God felt is not anger. It's grief, pain, a sorrow so deep the text says it reached all the way into his heart. So what really happened before the rain? What was so wrong with that world that the only answer was to wash it away? And why does the original language tell a story so different from the one you were taught in Sunday school? There are wild theories. Giants in the bloodline, angels who fell to earth, a myth stolen from an older civilization and dressed up in Hebrew. Some of them are strange. Some of them are almost convincing. But the truth is stranger than all of them and far more human. Let me show you. To understand the flood, you have to understand the world that provoked it. And that world was not a cartoon of villains twirling their mustaches. Picture the ancient Near East. The cradle of civilization, the long green ribbon of land between the Tigris and the Euphrates, the place we call Mesopotamia. This is the world the book of Genesis grows out of. A world of the first cities, the first kings, the first written laws. A world that was, by every measure available to it, advancing, metalworking, agriculture, music. Genesis names these things in the generations before the flood. The man who forged bronze and iron, the father of those who play the harp and the flute. This was not a stupid world. It was a brilliant one. And that's the first thing most people get backwards. The world God judged was not primitive, it was sophisticated. It was thriving. It was, in its own eyes, succeeding. But notice what the text does with all that brilliance. One of the only men it lets speak before the flood is a descendant of Cain named Lamech, a man of that advancing age. And what does he do? He composes a song, a poem for his wives, the first recorded song in the Bible's telling of human history. And the song is about murder. I have slain a man to my wounding, he brags, and if Cain shall be avenged sevenfold, truly Lamech 70 and sevenfold. Read that again. The first anthem of civilization is a man boasting that he killed someone and will kill anyone who touches him. That's the tell. This world didn't lose its genius, it aimed it. Every advance, the bronze, the iron, the strength, the cities, became a sharper tool for the strong to crush the weak. Progress without goodness doesn't make a world safer, it just makes cruelty more efficient. And it was old. Genesis stretches 10 long generations between the first man and the flood. Lifespans measured in centuries, cities rising, knowledge accumulating, whole dynasties of human achievement piling up before the rain ever fell. This wasn't a quick experiment God abandoned in frustration. This was a civilization he watched patiently for a very long time, hoping it would turn. It didn't. And that patience matters, because it tells you the flood was never an impulse. So what goes wrong in a world that's winning? What corrupts a civilization at the height of its powers? Hold that question, because the answer is the whole point, and we're going to circle all the way back to it. First, we have to clear away the theories. And there are some big ones. Start with the wildest. The one that has launched 1,000 documentaries and 1 million late-night internet rabbit holes. The theory of the giants. It comes from 6 of the strangest verses in the entire Bible. Genesis 6, right before the flood. There were giants in the earth in those days, and also after that, when the sons of God came in unto the daughters of men, and they bare children to them. The Hebrew word is Nephilim, and the theory says this, that heavenly beings, fallen angels, came down and took human wives, and their children were a hybrid race, monstrous and mighty. The text even calls them mighty men which were of old, men of renown. Heroes, legends, the kind of names that get carved into monuments. And the theory says God sent the flood to wipe out this corrupted, half-divine bloodline before it swallowed the human race whole. It's a gripping story. Ancient texts outside the Bible ran wild with it. One of them, the Book of Enoch, blows those 6 verses into a sprawling epic of named angels teaching humanity how to forge weapons and wage war. And I'll be honest with you, those verses are genuinely mysterious, and serious scholars have argued about them for 2,000 years. But here's what most people overlook. Read the passage again, slowly, and watch what it actually blames. When God finally states his reason for the flood, he does not say, because of the giants. He does not say because of the sons of God. The Nephilim are mentioned and then dropped. The text moves past them. The verdict, when it comes, lands on something else entirely. On ordinary human beings and something growing inside them. So the giants aren't the reason. They're a distraction. Convenient, right? A monster to blame is always easier than a mirror. Keep that in mind, because the real culprit is much closer to home. Now the second theory, and this one wears a lab coat. It says the flood story isn't history at all. It's plagiarism. That the Hebrews simply copied it from an older, greater civilization. And the evidence, on the surface, is stunning. In 1872, a young researcher named George Smith sat in the British Museum, translating broken clay tablets dug out of the ruins of Nineveh. And on one of them, written in wedge-shaped cuneiform centuries before the Bible was compiled, he found it, a flood. A man told by a god to build a great boat, animals brought aboard, the waters rising, and at the end the man releases birds to find dry land and offers a sacrifice when the waters recede. The survivor's name was Utnapishtim, and he sent out a dove, then a swallow, then a raven, just as Noah sends out a raven and a dove to test the drying earth. It was the Epic of Gilgamesh, and the parallels to Noah were so exact that Smith, the story goes, grew so excited he began tearing off his clothes in the middle of the reading room. There's more. Another Mesopotamian text, the Epic of Atrahasis, older still. Same skeleton, a flood, a survivor, a boat. So the skeptics close the case. The flood is a myth, borrowed and rebranded, nothing more. But here's the detail that changes how you read all of it. Look at why the flood comes in those other stories. In Atrahasis, the gods drown humanity because people have multiplied and grown noisy, and the noise is keeping the gods awake. That's it. Overpopulation, insomnia, the gods are annoyed, so they exterminate the species. And then, when the flood is over and they're starving because no one is left to feed them with offerings, the gods swarm the survivors' sacrifice. The Gilgamesh tablet says it plainly, like flies. Do you feel the difference? In the pagan versions, the flood is petty, arbitrary. The gods are loud, hungry children breaking their own toys. There is no morality in it at all. The biblical account shares the shape, a boat, a survivor, the birds, the sacrifice. Shared shape is what you'd expect if a real event was remembered across many peoples. But it does not share the meaning. Genesis takes the same event and asks a question no other flood story dares to ask. Not, were the gods annoyed, but what is wrong with the human heart? That's not plagiarism. That's a civilization looking at the same ancient memory and seeing something no one else saw. So the borrowed myth theory collapses too, not because the parallels aren't real, but because the parallels prove the opposite of what people think. Hold that. We're almost to the answer. One more theory to clear. The gentle one, the comfortable one. It says, fine, forget giants and forget Babylon. The flood was just generic sin. People lied, people stole, people worshipped idols, so God pressed the reset button. It's the version you probably grew up with, vague wickedness met with vague wrath. And it's not wrong so much as it's lazy, because Genesis is not vague. Genesis is specific, almost surgically specific. It names the disease, and once you see the actual word the text uses, you cannot unsee it. Here's the real answer. Twice, in the verses that set up the flood, the Bible tells you exactly what filled the earth. Genesis 6, verse 11, "The earth also was corrupt before God, and the earth was filled with violence." Verse 13, "For the earth is filled with violence through them." That word, violence, is the Hebrew word Hamas. And Hamas doesn't mean vague naughtiness. It means brutality, cruelty, bloodshed. The strong crushing the weak. It's the word for the powerful taking whatever they want because no one can stop them. The world before the flood wasn't drowning in petty sins. It was drowning in violence. A civilization at the peak of its genius had turned all that genius into a machine for hurting people. It's the same word the prophets would later hurl at kings who robbed the poor and judges who sold justice to the highest bidder. Hamas is the cry of the victim who has no one left to appeal to. And Genesis says the whole earth was full of that cry. Picture it. Not cartoon villains, but a society where the powerful simply took, where the weak had no protection, where cruelty had become so normal that no one even flinched anymore. A world that had made peace with its own brutality. That is what filled the earth before the water did. Now watch the second word, because this is where it becomes almost unbearably precise. That phrase, the earth was corrupt. The Hebrew is shahat. And here's the detail that will change how you read the whole story. Shahat means corrupt. But shahat is also the exact same word used a few lines later for what God decides to do. I will destroy them. Corrupt, destroy, the same root. Do you understand what the writer is doing? The judgment is not something foreign that God imports from the outside. Humanity had already destroyed the earth, morally, spiritually, in the way they treated each other. God's response simply lets that destruction become what it already was. They had corrupted. He lets the corruption run to its end. The flood is not an overreaction. The flood is a mirror. And there's a third layer, deeper than either. Look at the waters themselves. In Genesis chapter 1, creation begins by God separating the waters, pushing back the deep, holding the chaos at bay, making a dry, safe space for life. The flood is that, reversed. The windows of heaven open, the fountains of the deep burst up, and the waters God once separated come rushing back together. This isn't just a big storm, it's uncreation. The world is being returned to the formless deep it was rescued from. That's why the language is so total. God isn't simply punishing the world, He's letting it slide back into the nothing it chose. Archaeology whispers underneath all of this. Dig into the ancient cities of southern Iraq, Kish, Shurapak, and in some of them, excavators found thick, clean layers of water-laid silt, sometimes many feet deep, sealing off one era of human settlement from the next. There's a famous moment from the 1920s. The archaeologist Leonard Woolley was sinking a deep shaft into the ruins of cutting down through layer after layer of pottery, rubble, and the debris of human living. And then, suddenly, all of it stopped. 8 feet of clean, empty river clay. No pottery, no tools, no trace of people at all. He thought he'd hit the bottom of everything. And then, beneath the clay, the human world began again. A whole different, older civilization buried under the mud. Woolley's wife looked down into that trench, at the band of silt dividing one world from another, and reportedly said simply, "Well, of course, it's the flood." A civilization, then a band of flood clay, then, above it, a world starting over. Real catastrophic flooding is woven into the memory of the very land Genesis comes from. Something happened there, something the whole region never forgot. But the archaeology only tells you that water came. It can't tell you why the story was written the way it was. For that, you have to go back to the strangest verse of all, and to the words most people read right past. Genesis 6, verse 6, right before the judgment. "And it repented the Lord that he had made man on the earth, and it grieved him at his heart." 2 words carry the weight of that sentence. It repented the Lord, the Hebrew is nacham, the ache of a decision no one wants to make, the heaviness of a heart that has to act and wishes it didn't. And then, it grieved him at his heart. That word is atzab, pain, sorrow. It's the same root the Bible uses for the pain of childbirth, for the sting of hard labor, for a wound that cuts deep. This is the first time in the entire Bible that God is described feeling pain. Not the humans, God. The Creator looks at what His creation has done to itself, to the weak, to the innocent, to the good world He made, and the text says His heart breaks. That's the reason for the flood, not rage, grief. And here's where it lands on something human enough to touch, in the middle of a world defined by that word chamash. Violence, cruelty, the strong devouring the weak. There is one sentence that turns like a key. But Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. One man, not perfect, the Bible is careful never to call him perfect, just a man who walked differently in a world gone cruel. And because of that one man, God does not press delete on the human story, He presses save. And look at what God does next, because it is the exact opposite of what a furious deity would do. He doesn't just spare Noah, He hands him a blueprint. He tells him to gather the animals, not one of each, but pair after pair, life carried forward, the whole fragile future of creation loaded plank by plank onto a wooden box floating over the ruin of the old world. The ark is not a weapon. The ark is a seed. God is grieving, and even while He grieves, He is already building a way through. Notice how the text spends a single verse on the reason for the drowning, and chapter after chapter on the mechanics of the rescue. Read it honestly and you realize the flood story is not mostly about water, it's mostly about a door left open and a God pleading with a world to come inside before the storm. Think about what that means. The most famous story of divine judgment in human history is, when you read it in its own words, actually a story about a God who would rather feel the pain Himself than let cruelty win. A God who looks at a violent world not with a clenched fist, but with a broken heart. and who, in the very same breath as the judgment, reaches down to save everyone willing to climb aboard. That's the real reason for the great flood, not that God ran out of patience, but that love, when it looks at cruelty, cannot stay indifferent. The flood is what it looks like when a good God refuses to shrug at a world that has learned to hurt. And when the waters finally fell, and the dove came back with a single green olive leaf in its beak, the first living thing growing again in a scrubbed and silent world, God hung something in the sky. The rainbow at the end was never a decoration. It was a promise that grief, not wrath, would always have the final word. If you made it this far, there's a companion to this one already waiting for you on screen. The truth about what the ark actually was, and why its measurements tell a story of their own. And if this changed how you read those old familiar verses, consider subscribing so the next mystery finds its way to you. The Bible is deeper than you were told. Come further in.